Good morning, everyone. It is Friday, October 17th. Welcome to the Inside Edge. We've gotten a new spate of polling this week in the New Jersey gubernatorial race. We had a poll from Quinnipiac on Wednesday that showed Mikey Sherrill leading Jack Ciattarelli by 6 points. We had one from Fox News last night that had Sherrill up by 5 points. And then just this morning, we've got a new one from Fairleigh Dickinson University that shows Sherrill leading by 7 points. Obviously, those polls are kind of all of a kind with one another. They all tell a pretty similar story of Mikey Sherrill having a lead, but it's not a huge one. And I think both campaigns can reasonably take these polls and spin them into something that looks positive for them. But I don't really want to dive too deeply into that. Instead, I want to talk about the state of polling in general in New Jersey, and specifically the chances that pollsters are going to get this election completely wrong. Somewhat famously, in 2021, polls generally missed the fact that Jack Ciattarelli was running a super competitive race against Phil Murphy. I went into the polling averages and pulled out the 4 final polls from 4 in-state pollsters in 2021: Stockton, Monmouth, FDU, and Rutgers. And on average, those 4 pollsters found Murphy leading Ciattarelli by 9.2 percentage points. And Murphy ended up only winning by 3.2 percentage points. So based on those 4 polls alone, no others, there was an average polling miss of 6 percentage points. You might have guessed where I'm going with this. The 3 polls from this week of this year's race have Sherrill up by an average of 6 percentage points. So if you were to just purely transport the exact polling error from 2021 onto this year's race, then the fact that Sherrill has this modest lead in all of these polls is actually an indication that the race is functionally tied, that things are going to be incredibly close come election day. And that's something that I've seen some Republicans kind of automatically doing. I've seen on social media Ciattarelli supporters manually unskewing these polls to show where they think the race is at. Ciattarelli has also released internal polls showing the race basically tied or even with him a little bit ahead. And I think we absolutely can't discount the possibility that just like they were wrong in 2021, the polls will be wrong again in 2025, and Jack Ciattarelli is actually doing better than most of these polls suggest. But I also wanted to raise the possibility, first of all, that the polls end up being right. Polls have taken a beating in some recent election cycles, but not all. There have been some elections, including in New Jersey, where the polls have been basically spot on. I think the 2017 gubernatorial race and the 2018 Senate and House races, those races were all pretty heavily polled. And the polls, with some noise here or there, some variance here or there, were kind of correct. They all, did a pretty good job of capturing where those races ended up. And so, we could end up looking at a scenario where Mikey Sherrill comes into election night and wins by 6 or 7 percentage points. We look at a bunch of polls that said exactly that and say, wow, they figured it out. And we also can't discount the possibility that the polls will miss in the other direction. This has started to seem like a little bit of a remote possibility because, in part, because Donald Trump keeps on beating his polls, and it seems like it's impossible for polls to underestimate Democrats. But it's certainly happened in the past, and there's no reason to believe that if a polling error is hypothetically possible 6 points in favor of Republicans, that it wouldn't also be possible 6 points in favor of Democrats. And that this Sherrill plus 6 average that we've seen in the polls this week will actually translate to a Sherrill plus 12 election night. And it ends up being a pretty substantial victory. And a bunch of Democrats will wonder why they got themselves so worked up about this in the first place. Polling is just generally a fickle industry. And that's something that any pollster will tell you. They will list the different ways that uncertainty enters into their field. There's margins of error already built into polls that say, this sample could be off in this way or that way, and that's sort of the level of uncertainty that we have. Polls are snapshots in time that don't always reflect what happens between when it's taken and when the election is actually held. Pollsters may have to make assumptions about what an electorate will look like that might not reflect what actually happens on election day, in terms of who turns out, in terms of whose voters are more enthusiastic, so on and so forth. So my overarching point here is that every new poll that we get is an interesting data point and one that we should, sort of input into our analysis of these races, but they're also not the end all be all of what we think is happening here. And we have to be prepared that they're going to be wrong. And we have to be prepared that we don't know whether they're going to be wrong and in what direction they'll be wrong. So basically, uncertainty reigns here. And I think everybody would do well to remember that. So that's all I've got for today. Have a great weekend.